The morning of June 12th, 2017, started like any other for 72-year-old James Wilson. The Vietnam veteran woke up at 5 a.m., made his coffee, and prepared for his daily 3-mile walk. But halfway through tying his shoelaces, something went terribly wrong. I couldn't feel my left hand anymore. Then my face started to droop. I tried to call out to my wife, but the words, they just wouldn't come out right. In that moment, I knew exactly what was happening. I was having a stroke. And all I could think was, this is it. After surviving Vietnam, after all these years. This is how it ends. James had always been proud of his physical resilience. As a Marine who served 2 tours in Vietnam from 1968 to 1970, he'd endured extreme conditions and pushed his body to its limits. After returning home, he made a commitment to stay active, even as he aged. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd survived firefights and jungle warfare in my 20s, but here I was, taken down by my own body while putting on my walking shoes. My wife found me slumped against the bedroom wall and called 911 immediately. The paramedics later told me that her quick action probably saved my life. The ambulance rushed James to the VA Medical Center, where doctors confirmed he had suffered an ischemic stroke. A blood clot had blocked an artery supplying blood to his brain. The medical team administered tissue plasminogen activator, or TPA, a clot-busting drug that can reduce long-term disability if given within the first few hours after a stroke. I remember bits and pieces from the hospital. The bright lights, the doctors asking me questions I couldn't answer, my wife's worried face. But mostly, I remember the fear. Not fear of dying. I'd made peace with my mortality long ago in Vietnam. No, this was the fear of living. Living as half the man I used to be. When James regained full consciousness the next day, the extent of the damage became clear. The left side of his body was severely weakened. His speech was slurred. Simple tasks like holding a cup or standing up were now monumental challenges. The doctor came in and started explaining what had happened. He used all these medical terms: hemiparesis, dysarthria, rehabilitation protocols. But all I heard was that I might never walk normally again. Might never speak clearly again. Might need help with basic things for the rest of my life. I just shut down mentally. I couldn't process it, for a man who had built his identity around physical strength and independence, the prognosis was devastating. James spent 3 days in acute care before being transferred to the VA's inpatient rehabilitation unit. His first days there were marked by despair. I refused to participate in therapy at first. I was angry at my body, at the doctors, at the whole situation. Why bother with all these exercises if I was just going to be disabled anyway? I told my wife not to visit anymore. I didn't want her to see me like that. I didn't want anyone to see me like that. James's attending physician, Dr. Sarah Chen, recognized the signs of depression that often accompany stroke recovery. She arranged for him to speak with a psychologist who specialized in working with veterans experiencing health crises. This psychologist, Dr. Martinez, he came in and didn't try to cheer me up or give me some rah-rah speech. Instead, he asked me about Vietnam. Asked how I'd gotten through the toughest days there. We talked about resilience and adaptation, skills I'd already proven I had. He reminded me that this was just another battlefield, different terrain but the same warrior. A week into rehabilitation, James had a visitor he wasn't expecting, another Vietnam veteran who had survived a stroke 5 years earlier. The man walked into James's room with only a slight limp, speaking clearly though somewhat more slowly than average. "This guy Ron, he just pulls up a chair and says, 'So I hear you're giving up.' Just like that." I was offended at first, ready to tell him to get out. But then he showed me a photo of himself from right after his stroke. He couldn't stand, couldn't speak a complete sentence. And here he was now, walking and talking, living independently. Something clicked for me then. If he could do it, maybe I could too. That conversation marked a turning point in James's recovery journey. The next morning, he asked his physical therapist to help him try standing again. It was painful, frustrating, and he could only manage a few seconds, but it was a start. I decided to approach rehab like a military operation. I needed a mission, objectives, and a strategy. My mission was independence. My primary objective was to walk again, even if it wasn't the same as before. My strategy was to follow my therapist's instructions to the letter and push myself a little further each day. James's military background gave him a framework for the grueling rehabilitation process. He was accustomed to discipline, too. Pushing through pain, to focusing on incremental progress rather than the distant goal. In Vietnam, we measured success in feet gained, hills taken, perimeters secured. In rehab, success was measured in fingers that could wiggle, words that came out clearly, seconds I could stand without support. Small victories, but victories nonetheless. James's rehabilitation schedule was intense, 3 hours of therapy every day, divided between physical therapy, occupational therapy, and speech therapy. Each discipline addressed different aspects of his stroke-related deficits. Physical therapy was the hardest for me physically. Learning to transfer from bed to wheelchair to standing. Working on balance, strength, coordination. My PT, Marcus, was tougher than any drill sergeant I'd ever had. He'd say, "One more rep, James," and somehow I'd find the strength to do it. Occupational therapy focused on relearning everyday activities, dressing, bathing, eating with utensils. These seemingly simple tasks now required immense concentration and modified techniques. My OT, Lisa, taught me how to button a shirt one-handed, how to use adaptive tools to maintain my independence. I hated needing these tools at first. They felt like admissions of weakness. But Lisa helped me see them differently. "These aren't crutches," she'd say. "They're weapons in your arsenal for fighting back." Speech therapy addressed James's dysarthria, the slurred, imprecise speech caused by weakness in the muscles used for speaking. My speech therapist, Diane, had me doing these exercises that felt ridiculous, sticking out my tongue, exaggerating sounds, practicing the same phrases over and over. But I noticed the improvements. My wife said she could understand me better on the phone. That was huge for me. Knowing I could still communicate clearly with the people I love. Throughout this intensive rehabilitation period, James experienced the full emotional spectrum of recovery, determination and despair often within the same hour. The progress was rarely linear, which tested his resolve. There were days when everything seemed to be improving. I could take an extra step, speak a little clearer, button one more button. Then there'd be days when I felt like I was sliding backward. Those were the days that tested me most. I'd think about giving up. But then I'd remember something my squad leader used to say in Vietnam: "The only easy day was yesterday," so I'd get up and try. Again, as weeks turned into months, James's physical recovery progressed steadily. By his 3rd month post-stroke, he could walk short distances with a quad cane. His speech, while still slower than before, was clear and understandable. He had regained enough dexterity in his affected hand to manage most self-care tasks. But James's journey involved more than just physical rehabilitation. He was also confronting deep questions about identity, purpose, and mortality that the stroke had brought to the surface. When you face something like this, it forces you to reevaluate everything. Who am I if I'm not completely self-sufficient? What value do I have if my body doesn't work the way it used to? These weren't new questions. I'd faced versions of them when I returned from Vietnam. But the stroke made them immediate and unavoidable. Working with Dr. Martinez, the VA psychologist, James began exploring these questions. He also joined a support group specifically for veteran stroke survivors. Being with other vets who understood both the military mindset and the stroke experience, that was invaluable. We could talk about things civilians might not get. How the stroke recovery process triggers some of the same stress responses as combat. How asking for help feels like a surrender when you've been trained to be self-reliant. Through these conversations, James began developing a new perspective on his stroke journey, seeing it not as a devastating end, but as another chapter in his life, one that could have meaning and purpose. One of the guys in the support group said something that really stuck with me. He said, "We survived the war to come home and fight different battles." That resonated deeply. This stroke was just another battle, and I was still a warrior, even if the weapons and tactics were different now. 6 months after his stroke, James was discharged from formal rehabilitation therapy, though he continued with home exercises and occasional outpatient sessions. He could walk independently, with a cane for moderate distances. His speech was nearly back to normal, though he still struggled when tired. His left hand would never regain full dexterity, but he had adapted to using it as a supportive hand, while his right did the precision work. But something was still missing. Before his stroke, James had been actively involved in his community, volunteering with the local VFW post, mentoring at-risk youth, and maintaining an active social life. His reduced mobility and lingering fatigue had curtailed many of these activities. I was physically better, but I felt purposeless. I'd sit at home watching TV, doing my exercises, waiting for my wife to come home from work. That wasn't living, that was existing. And I knew from my military days that a mission is what gives meaning to hardship. The turning point came when James's speech therapist, Diane, asked him to speak to a new stroke patient, a 45-year-old woman who was struggling with motivation in her recovery. I was nervous about it. What did I have to offer this woman? Our situations were completely different. But I went anyway, and we talked for almost an hour. Later, Diane told me that it was the first time this patient had engaged fully in a conversation since her stroke. Something about hearing from someone further along the recovery path had reached her in a way the medical professionals couldn't. This experience sparked something in James. He approached the rehabilitation department about creating a peer mentorship program for stroke survivors. Drawing on his military experience with buddy systems and his own stroke recovery journey, he developed a framework where more recovered patients could support those just beginning rehabilitation. The VA administrators were surprisingly receptive. They'd been looking for ways to address the high rates of depression and therapy noncompliance among stroke patients. Having a veteran who understood both military culture and stroke recovery design the program was ideal. Within 2 months, James had recruited 10 veteran stroke survivors as the first mentors. The program, which they named Forward March, Veteran Stroke Recovery, paired new stroke patients with mentors who were at least 1 year post-stroke. It wasn't just about giving advice or encouragement, though that was part of it. It was about showing new stroke survivors a living example of what recovery could look like. When a patient sees their doctor or therapist, they're seeing someone who's telling them recovery is possible. When they see a mentor, they're seeing someone who's showing them recovery is possible. That's a powerful difference. As the mentorship program grew, James found himself speaking to larger groups, first at VA hospitals, then at civilian rehabilitation centers and stroke support organizations. His story of resilience resonated with audiences, and his straightforward, sometimes blunt approach cut through the often sanitized narratives of recovery. I don't sugarcoat it when I speak to groups. I tell them about the days I cried in frustration, trying to button my shirt. About the time I fell in the bathroom and couldn't get up until my wife found me. About the dark thoughts that come at 3 a.m. when pain keeps you awake. But I also tell them about the first time I walked to the mailbox without my cane. The moment I realized I just had a normal conversation without thinking about my words. The satisfaction of helping another stroke survivor find their way forward. 2 years after his stroke, James expanded his advocacy work. He began collaborating with researchers, studying the unique aspects of stroke recovery in the veteran population. He advocated for policy changes to improve rehabilitation access for veterans living in rural areas. He even testified before a congressional committee on veterans' health issues. If you told me on the day of my stroke that 2 years later I'd be speaking to Congress about stroke recovery, I would have thought you were hallucinating. But that's the strange thing about life-changing events. They can close some doors while opening others you never knew existed. James also found unexpected connections. Between his Vietnam experiences and his stroke recovery that helped both him and other veterans. Many of us who served in Vietnam came home with undiagnosed PTSD. We didn't talk about it, just pushed it down and moved on. But the stroke, being vulnerable, dependent, scared, it brought up a lot of those buried feelings. Working through my stroke recovery actually helped me process some of that old trauma too. And I found many other vets had similar experiences. This insight led James to collaborate with the VA's mental health services to develop resources specifically addressing the intersection of combat trauma and health crises like stroke. The initiative helped veterans recognize how past trauma might affect their response to new health challenges and provided strategies for using their military-acquired resilience constructively. What amazes me is how the worst day of my recent life, the day of my stroke, somehow led to some of the most meaningful work I've ever done. I'm not glad I had a stroke, don't get me wrong. But I am grateful for the perspective it's given me and the purpose I've found through it. Now 5 years post-stroke, James's physical recovery has plateaued in many ways. He still walks with a cane for longer distances. His left hand still lacks fine motor control. He tires more easily than before his stroke. But his life has expanded in ways he never anticipated. Recovery isn't a straight line with a clear endpoint. It's more like a winding path that keeps going. Some days are harder than others. I still have moments of frustration when I drop something or struggle with a task that used to be simple. But those moments don't define me anymore. James continues to lead the peer mentorship program, which has now expanded to 12 VA medical centers across the country. He speaks regularly at rehabilitation conferences and stroke support groups. And he's written a memoir about his experiences, titled Forward March, A Soldier's Guide to Stroke Recovery. Writing the book was therapeutic for me. It helped me make sense of this journey, connecting my military past with my stroke present. And the response from readers has been incredible. I get letters from stroke survivors and their families saying it gave them hope when they needed it most. At 77, James acknowledges that he's in a different phase of life than he was before his stroke. But he rejects the notion that his best days are behind him. I've had to adjust my expectations and adapt to new limitations. But adaptation is what humans do best. It's certainly what soldiers learn to do. My life isn't the same as it was before the stroke. But different doesn't mean worse. In some ways, it's richer, more purposeful. James's wife of 53 years, Margaret, has been his steadfast partner throughout this journey. When asked about her perspective, she offers a characteristically straightforward assessment. Maggie says the stroke didn't change who I am. It just revealed parts of me that had always been there, but hadn't been needed before. My stubbornness became determination. My discipline became consistency in therapy. My leadership skills found new application in the mentorship program. Reflecting on the 5 years since his stroke, James identifies several key lessons that have shaped his recovery journey and his work with other stroke survivors. First, recovery takes as long as it takes. Our medical system wants everything on a timetable. You get X weeks of therapy and then you're done. But the brain doesn't work that way. I'm still making small improvements 5 years later. Not as dramatic as the early months, but they're there. Second, the mental battle is as important as the physical one. I've seen patients with relatively minor physical effects struggle tremendously because they couldn't accept their new reality. And I've seen patients with severe disabilities thrive because they focused on what they could still do rather than what they'd lost. Third, purpose is powerful medicine. Having meaningful work, whether it's a job, volunteering, creating art, or whatever gives you a reason to get up in the morning, that's not supplemental to recovery, it's central to it. And finally, community matters. No one recovers from a stroke alone. You need professional help, of course, doctors, therapists, specialists. But you also need people who understand what you're going through. Fellow survivors who can say, "Me too," when you describe an experience that seems impossible to explain to someone who hasn't lived it. These insights form the core of James's message when he speaks to stroke survivors and their families. He's particularly passionate about reaching veterans, who often face unique challenges in recovery. Many vets struggle to accept help. We're trained to be self-reliant, to push through pain, to never show weakness. That mindset can be both helpful and harmful in stroke recovery. It can give you the determination to keep going when therapy gets tough, but it can also make you resist necessary assistance or push too hard too fast. James emphasizes that adapting military strengths to the stroke recovery context requires thoughtful translation. I tell veterans that stroke recovery is a different kind of mission. The objective isn't to defeat an external enemy, but to reclaim territory in your own body and mind. Your therapists aren't giving orders, they're intelligence officers providing crucial information. And accepting help isn't surrendering, it's utilizing available resources to achieve the mission. As James approaches his 6th year post-stroke, he continues to set goals for himself, both personal and for his advocacy work. I want to see the mentorship program become standard practice in every VA hospital with a stroke unit. The data shows it improves outcomes and reduces depression among participants. That's my main mission now. On a personal level, James focuses on maintaining his health and independence while accepting the reality of aging with stroke-related disabilities. I'm realistic about the future. I'm 77 years old. Even without the stroke, I'd be dealing with getting older. So I focus on what keeps me healthy and independent, staying active, eating well, keeping my mind engaged, and maintaining strong connections with family and friends. James and Margaret have also had to have difficult but necessary conversations about long-term care and end-of-life wishes, conversations that the stroke made more urgent and concrete. Having faced my mortality more directly because of the stroke, I'm actually more at peace with it now. I've made my wishes clear to Maggie and our children. I've put everything in order. Not because I'm planning to check out anytime soon, I've got too much left to do, but because having those matters settled lets me focus on living fully now. When asked what message he most wants to share with other stroke survivors, especially fellow veterans, James doesn't hesitate. I want them to know that a stroke is an event in your life, not the end of your life. It changes things, sometimes dramatically, but it doesn't have to define you or limit what your life can mean. After Vietnam, many of us adopted the motto, "Life is for the living." That's even more true after a stroke. He pauses, then adds with characteristic directness, "And I want them to know it's okay to grieve what you've lost." I still have moments of grief and anger about my stroke. But don't set up camp in that grief. Visit it when you need to, then keep marching forward. 5 years ago, when James Wilson slumped against his bedroom wall, unable to speak or move his left side, he thought his life was effectively over. Today, he leads a national peer mentorship program, speaks to audiences across the country, and has helped countless stroke survivors find their own path forward. If there's one thing I've learned through all this, it's that we're capable of so much more than we think we are. The human spirit is incredibly resilient. And sometimes our greatest contributions come after our greatest challenges. For those currently in the early stages of stroke recovery, whether veterans or civilians, James offers this final thought: take it one day at a time. Some days you'll see progress, other days you won't. Trust the process. Do the work. Lean on others when you need to. And remember that recovery isn't just about getting back what you lost. It's about discovering new strengths you never knew you had. If you're a stroke survivor or care for someone who is, resources like those James has helped develop are available through the VA and organizations like the American Stroke Association. The journey is challenging, but as James Wilson's story demonstrates, it can lead to unexpected new horizons and profound meaning. I thought my life was over that morning. I was wrong. It wasn't an ending. It was a difficult, painful, transformative new beginning.